Hi, this is John Harcher, and welcome to episode 26 of Valleys of Numenor. This time it's Tarzan of the movies, and the comic strips, and radio, TV. He's been a busy guy over the past 100 years. His presentation in most of these media isn't far off from how Edgar Rice Burroughs presented him in the original stories. But just one film helped set his image in popular culture and in completely the wrong direction. Episode 26 Tarzan of the movies and radio and comic strips, 1918 through 1942. Tarzan of the Apes was such an immediate hit, Burroughs knew he had a winner and started cranking out the Ape Man stories far faster than he did his other series, like John Carter of Mars. And eventually, the new medium of film beckoned. And then the newspaper comic strips, and then radio, and then TV, but let's not get ahead of ourselves too much. We'll do these in chunks. We'll do the silent movies, then the comics, then radio, and then go back to the movies a little bit, and that cultural defining presentation. I'll come out right now. I haven't seen all the Tarzan films. I'll make note of those when we get to them. But we'll hit the main ones right up through today. Tarzan has been around on screen since the early days of the movies. The first film was, appropriately, Tarzan of the Apes in 1918, made by the National Film Company and directed by Scott Sidney. We don't know him today, but he was a pretty busy guy back then. Burroughs made a sweet deal for the film rights, including a percentage of the gross, not a common practice in those days. The film was shot on location, just not in Africa, but the swamps of Louisiana. Now, your trivia books and sites have one answer for who was the first movie Tarzan, and they're sort of correct. Technically, the first film Tarzan was a kid named Gordon Griffith who played Tarzan as a little boy. It's not just one scene, he's in the picture a good 15, 20 minutes. He's also butt naked for part of the time. They thankfully kept it to the back, or else this would be a whole different kind of film. And it's part of the plot that Tarzan sees natives and realizes he should be wearing clothes. In the book, he kills one and takes his stuff. Here, he just steals their clothes when they're swimming, thankfully. That could open up a whole new can of worms. But the real first Tarzan we all know is Elmo Lincoln. The book describes Tarzan as powerful but more sleek, like a panther. There's nothing sleek about Elmo. He's a big, burly, barrel-chested guy who played him like a bull in a china shop. There's a famous story where Tarzan is rescuing Jane, played by Enid Markey, the first of many brunettes to play the blonde Jane. Go figure. When she's trapped in a cabin by a lion. Tarzan grabs the lion and drags him away. Then the story goes Elmo actually killed the lion with his knife. There's some confusion if it happened in this picture or a later one. I mean, did he kill two of them? But one way or another, film was a big hit. The movie did set the template for the somewhat crazed natives that would populate jungle pictures from this point forward. Jane's maid Esmeralda was played by the pioneering actress Madame Solti Wen. She was stuck with roles like this for many years, since that's all there was, but she ended up giving some acclaimed performances later on. Supposedly, Friar Tuck himself, Eugene Pallette, is somewhere in the cast. The original print may have run anywhere from 2 to 3 hours, but we only got an hour left of it today. That's an hour more than what we have of the sequel, The Romance of Tarzan. It's one of the first movie sequels to come out the same year as the first film and not do as well as its predecessor. King Kong, Godzilla, and Star Wars would later fall prey to this. It's based on the last third of Tarzan of the Apes. It features Lincoln and Markey back again in the lead roles. The first film left Tarzan, Jane, and the rest of her group there in the jungle. This one has Tarzan heading to the Old West, where Jane's father has a ranch. The bad guys come and wrangle off Jane. Oh, that's almost an F-Troop reference there. And it's up to Tarzan, brand new to civilization, to rescue her. This is one of the many silent films that, to the best of anyone's knowledge, just doesn't exist anymore. The old nitrate stock was very fragile and combustible. Most of it either just fell apart or went up in smoke, like the MGM fire of 1965 that took out things like London After Midnight. It appears this one just fell apart and no one bothered to keep it around. Had they known. The director of this film, Wilfred Lucas, became a frequently seen character actor through the 30s, working for other silent film veterans like Cecil B. DeMille and John Ford. After a year off, Tarzan returned to the screen in 1920 in the guise of a new actor, Gene Poller. Only he really wasn't an actor, he was a New York fireman the new producers hired because they presumably couldn't get Elmo Lincoln. Now, the name of the movie depends on where you were. If you were in England, it was The Return of Tarzan, named so after the book it was adapting. In the US, they called it The Revenge of Tarzan. Only based on the plot, he really doesn't get revenge too much. It's based on the first two parts of the Return of Tarzan book, the Paris and Sub Saharan Africa parts, though they add in the tossing off the boat incident. Now, the current existence of this film is up for debate. It's known for sure that a US copy was destroyed in the MGM fire, but there may be a copy of the British version in an archive there. However, it's not available for viewing in any form. It's possible the film is so deteriorated that it can't be put through a projector without falling apart. It may need such an extensive restoration, like a digital frame by frame capture, that the owners can't afford to do it. I mean, famed film restorer Robert Harris was unable to get anyone to pony up to do a proper restoration of John Wayne's 1960 version of the Alamo, so what chance did they have? After two disappointing outings, Burroughs and the producers decided to try something different. Instead of one film, they do a serial. These had begun to become popular in the US in the late teens, though they'd been popular in France around the time of World War I. This one would be based on Son of Tarzan, shifting the focus a bit. Casting proved to be an issue once again. They had one actor lined up to play Korak, but he dropped out. They finally ended up finding Hawaiian actor Kamula C. Cyril, who'd been seen in C.B. DeMille's Male and Female. For Jane, they rehired Carla Schramm from Revenge of Tarzan. Another returning player was Gordon Griffith, this time playing the young Jack Clayton. He also replaced another actor. Boy, who knew this role was so tough to cast? Once again, Elmo Lincoln was not available, so they had to look elsewhere. They ended up hiring P. Dempsey Tabler, a sort of jack of all trades. He was a light opera singer, did some producing behind the scenes, and may have helped start a little enterprise called Paramount Pictures. One of his early films is related to a movie we discussed back in the Halloween special. 1919's Love Insurance by Earl Durr Biggers, creator of Charlie Chan, was remade a few times. The 1940 version was named One Night in the Tropics, which was notable for the screen debuts of Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. See, it all ties together. By the time he was hired for this film, Tabler was over 40 and balding. Not sure why they thought he'd be good for the part. Owing to those things, maybe he physically bears a little resemblance to Elmo, just not as barrel chested. So they figured just toss a wig on him. For most of the film, he has a normal looking toupee, like, one of Shatner's multiple ones. But in the early Tarzan scenes, they give him this long haired wig. He looks like Bob Newhart playing Tarzan on the Carol Burnett show or something like that. Hello, Greystoke residents. Yeah, no, I didn't order 30,000 pounds of bananas. Hey, hang on. Honey, what do you want, Tarzan? Sorry, that's my best Suzanne Plachette. Did you order 30,000 pounds of bananas? What would I do with 30,000 pounds of bananas? Good point. No, I don't think. You say it was a high pitched voice? Cheetah! That's my Bob Newhart routine. Anyway, after a quick recap of Tarzan of the Apes, the story basically plays out as it is in the book. Paulvich, here called Paulovich, is lost in the jungle from a previous incident. Now, Beast of Tarzan was never adapted into a film, so we just have to take it for granted. Over the next 15 chapters, the serial hits all the main points from the novel. I made the joke last time that there's a real Blue Lagoon element to the story. It's even clearer on screen. The girl playing Miriam, her top slips open every now and then, and the two say they develop feelings before one of those silent movie makeout scenes. They're moving fast and hands moving all over the place, kind of like the one in Gilligan's Island with the professor and Ginger. A couple of odd things for today's audiences. For some reason, they changed the name on the title cards from Grey Stoke to Grey Stone. Sounds like a Flintstones episode. Then it's a little confusing if you've watched serials on Turner Classic Movies or back in the old days on PBS, like Flash Gordon. At the end of the episode, they give you the name of the next episode as a preview for next week. In these, they just repeat the name of the current episode. If you don't watch it too closely, you might think you missed an episode. Took me until episode 11 to figure that out. Then there was another behind the scenes incident that helped the film's publicity. At the end of the serial, as in the book, there's a sequence where Tantor, the elephant, rescues Korak from being burned at the stake by lifting it out of the ground and carrying him away in his trunk. The scene here is done note for note. But when the elephant puts the stake down, he does it too hard and injured Cyril right on camera. The story then went out that the actor actually died on set. It turned out the injuries were bad and he was forced to leave the industry, but he did survive. Unfortunately, he developed cancer and did pass away in 1924. But the serial was a big success and prompted a new group of producers to work with the guys who did Revenge of Tarzan, and this time they managed to get a hold of Elmo Lincoln again. They also got director Scott Sidney back to film some of the 15-chapter serial, The Adventures of Tarzan. This one will be based on the second half of Return of Tarzan, plus mix in parts of Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar. This film marked the first of only 2 appearances of La on the big screen, and both in the silent era. About halfway through filming, the insurance company didn't want Lincoln doing so many of his own stunts, so they hired a stuntman, Frank Merrill, to do some of the more dangerous ones. We'll hear more from him in a bit. Though the serial was also successful, it would be the last Tarzan film for 5 years. The next one will be based on Tarzan and the Golden Lion, which is odd for it to jump like that, but I guess it was easier than trying to do Pal Udon or The Land of the Ant-Man. It was also time for a new Tarzan, and this time out, it was an actual acquaintance of Burroughs himself, James Pierce. He was a high school football coach who'd begun doing movies on the side, playing Harry March in the 1923 version of The Deerslayer called Leatherstocking. But he still kept coaching, and one of his students ended up following him into the film industry during his days at USC. Marion Morrison did a lot of set work on films by John Ford, and got a starring role in a Raoul Walsh film, who decided to change his name to John Wayne. To take the role in this film, Pierce had to pass on another one, a World War I picture named Wings. His part was taken by an actor from Montana named Gary Cooper. The film follows the bare bones of the story. There's no Korak, no trip home from Paludan. A few characters are there, like Miranda, and a few of his conspirators, but not Bloober. There's also the witch doctor Awaza, and unfortunately, he's played by a white actor in blackface. But in this case, it's of major interest as he was played by British actor William Henry Pratt. I don't think he's any relation to Chris. We know him better as Boris Karloff. Now, the oddest addition to the story is Betty Greystoke, who's Tarzan's sister. Okay, let's work this out a minute. Tarzan's parents are abandoned in the jungle when he's born and they die there. If that's the case, where does the sister come from? And why? She really doesn't do anything in the movie. It could have been Jane's sister, her cousin, or Tarzan's cousin. Any number of other relations would work just fine, except a sister. The movie did not do well at the box office, but things did work out in other ways for James Pierce. A year later, in 1928, he married Burroughs' daughter, Joan. He continued to find work in the business, including another pass at Tarzan, though not on screen. His most famous role was in another pulp-related picture. He played Prince Thun the Lion Man in the 1936 serial Flash Gordon, featuring another Tarzan we'll talk about in a bit. So it was back to the drawing board for the next Tarzan film, Tarzan the Mighty, in 1928. This time they returned to the serial format, and it was at one of the older studios, Universal. Playing the ape man, they went to someone with some experience with the role. No, not Elmo again, but his stuntman, Frank Merrill. He set the template for future Tarzans in that he was an athletic champion, in this case gymnastics. It suited the character well and helped him develop something that later iterations would embrace wholeheartedly, namely swinging on a vine. Now, this is another example where the film itself is lost, but luckily the scripts from all 15 chapters still survive. The Burroughs Company put it out as a book in 2005. It's loosely based on Jungle Tales of Tarzan, and from the descriptions I read online, very loosely. I have to try to take a look for the book at some point. Funnily enough, Frank Merrill was a finalist in the world's most perfectly developed man contest, yet he was almost completely covered up compared to the previous Tarzans. But it was successful enough to warrant a sequel, Tarzan the Tiger, in 1929. In the original magazine edition of Tarzan of the Apes An Old Story, the giant cats were Numa the lion, Sheeta the leopard, and Sabor the tiger. And somebody brought up to Burroughs that there are no tigers in Africa, so for the book edition, he changed Sabor to a lioness. But they went ahead with the name Tiger for the movie. This one is based on the parts of Jewels of Opar that weren't used for the adventures of Tarzan. And now there was something else to use, sound. It wasn't a full talkie, but had a music score, and Tarzan actually did his yell. Not the one we know, but it was a start. Unfortunately for Merrill, the coming of sound was also the end of his career. Like many silent actors and actresses, his voice was deemed not really good for talking pictures. But just as that was happening, Tarzan began to make his mark in another visual medium, this time the comic strips. It started in early 1929 and was first drawn by Hal Foster, who'd go on to later create Prince Valiant. It ran for 2 years as a daily strip, then in 1931, the Sunday full page strip premiered. The daily strip mostly adapted the novels and other stories, while the Sunday strip did original stories. Two of the more famous artists to do runs on the title were Byrne Hogarth in the late 30s and 40s, and Russ Manning in the late 60s and 70s. The Hogarth run has been reprinted in big, oversized editions to fully capture the beautifully detailed art. So, for a few years, things were quiet on the movie front. That all changed when MGM decided to try their hand at a Tarzan film. They had had a big success in 1931 with the film Trader Horn, filmed on location in Africa. So they had that film's director, W.S. Van Dyke, assigned to their version, Tarzan the Ape Man. It wouldn't be an exact adaptation of Tarzan the Apes, but they'd use it as a springboard. Head of production Irving Thalberg had to find the right Tarzan and Jane, and history shows he did pretty good. For Jane Parker rather than Porter, he chose a young actress recently signed to MGM, Maureen O'Sullivan. Instead of being from Baltimore, they had Jane and her father be British, though, as you can tell from her last name, O'Sullivan was Irish. For Tarzan, writer Cyril Hume brought MGM's attention to Johnny Weissmuller, swimming champion at the 1924 and 1928 Olympics. One minor issue, Johnny had a contract with BVD to model their underwear. The studio wanted him so badly, they offered some of the stars in their stable, including Greta Garbo, to do ads instead. BVD took the deal. As for the others in the cast, C. Aubrey Smith plays Jane's father. Back then, he excelled at these kind of roles. Neil Hamilton plays Harry, a guy who thinks he wants to be Jane's love interest but isn't great in the jungle. Folks these days will recognize him as Commissioner Gordon from the Batman show back in the 60s. And one of the natives is played by dwarf actor Angelo Rosito. He's best known for a role he played 50 years later, the Master in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. If you know him from there, you may ask how he's playing a pygmy. Yeah, he's in blackface and black body makeup too. Yeah. The basic plot is Jane joins her father and Harry in the jungle as they search for the fabled elephant graveyard. Along the way, they meet Tarzan as he keeps his distance but is curious. He saves them from a bunch of animal attacks but decides to run off with Jane. Now, it's here that the most famous line from the movie is not said. Johnny Weissmuller never says, "Meet Tarzan, you, Jane," in this picture, or any other for that matter. She does teach him her name, and somehow he figures out his name is Tarzan. He then goes back and forth saying their names as he points to each other. Tarzan, Jane, Tarzan, Jane. He keeps punching her harder and harder until she gets him to stop. Tarzan brings her back to her father, and they continue towards the elephant graveyard. It's here that they're attacked by the pygmies in blackface. Kind of uncomfortable watching it now, but yeah, it is what it is. Tarzan gets a herd of elephants, Indian elephants with big plastic ears to make them look like they're the African kind, to stampede in the village and rescue the captives. They do reach the elephant graveyard, but Jane's father succumbs to his injuries. Harry heads back to civilization while Jane stays behind with Tarzan. The film was a huge hit and ended up leaving a number of impressions on the pop culture identity of Tarzan. The first is his being not very well spoken. I mean, Johnny wasn't going out and doing King Lear anytime soon, but he was a good enough actor to be given a few more lines. But their approach does make sense. There was no Darno in this version, so there's no one until Jane to teach him how to speak. But now when people think Tarzan, they think the monosyllabic muscle guy rather than the character Burroughs wrote. It also introduced Cheetah as Tarzan's chimp companion. In the books, it was the monkey Nakima, but for the movie, they went with Jigs the chimp. Then there's the famous Tarzan yell. Burroughs does describe Tarzan as giving the victory cry of a bull ape. Tarzan the Tiger had Frank Merrill doing a short version of it, but the 1932 version has become immortal and an integral part of the culture. And also give Carol Burnett something to do each week when the audience asks her questions. We all know what it sounds like. I'm not going to do it here. Please. Everybody will wonder what's going on there. But what is it exactly? There doesn't seem to be a concrete story on exactly what it is and who did it. One story has it being an opera singer, another has it being the creation of like three voices put together, yet another has it being a mix of all kind of animals. Weissmuller said he did it himself based on some old German beer hall calls. I'm going to go with it being one person. Now, whether it's Johnny or opera singer Lloyd Leach, that I don't know. So, with the film being a success, it led to other projects. Talks began for a sequel over at MGM. It also provided the opportunity for Tarzan to go on radio. The first show premiered in September 1932 on WOR in New York, a station that's still on the air today. It had a familiar Tarzan, James Pierce, and a familiar Jane, Pierce's wife and Burroughs' own daughter, Joan. The show adapted Tarzan of the Apes to start. You can hear a bunch of the episodes online. After 2 years, they changed format and cast. For 1934 and 1935, they did season long serials. 1934 was The Diamond of Asher, and 1935 was The Fires of Tor. I found the 1934 serial online. I haven't found the second one yet. We've actually talked about the first one already. A few years later, Burroughs himself adapted it into Tarzan and the Forbidden City. After that, the series didn't return until 1950, and that one ran a couple of years. Those episodes are found easily online. Now, while MGM was making Tarzan the Ape Man, it turns out another production company was making their own Tarzan film. Producer Saul Lesser had picked up a contract from a few years earlier for several Tarzan films, presumably after Tarzan the Tiger. The company that took it out went out of business, so it was thought the contract expired. But it hadn't, so Lesser was able to make his own project. This would be a serial like the earlier successful Silence. And based on MGM's casting of Johnny Weissmuller, Lesser decided to get his own Olympic swimming star. He got 1932 gold medal winner Buster Crabbe for his Tarzan. Like MGM, they decided to have him not do a lot of talking, but instead a lot of laughing. It's kind of disconcerting, to be honest. What's also disconcerting is Crabbe's loincloth covers the front, but not quite the back. It's not exactly a thong loincloth, but it's really close. The original 15 chapter version of the serial doesn't appear to exist anywhere, but two versions are still around. An hour-long version that is the first 4 episodes edited together is out there, as is a British version that runs around 86 minutes. They don't have a Jane, but they have a blonde Mary, so we're getting closer to the books. The longer one gives a slightly better idea of what the serial was about. Crabbe actually does look a bit more like the Tarzan of the books, whereas Weissmuller was at that point, and especially later, more in the Elmo Lincoln camp. But in the end, it was not as successful as they hoped. Crabbe did end up playing a lot of other Jungle Man characters before heading over to Universal to work on a serial about another pulp character who, and we just mentioned about blondes, this character was a blonde. Flash Gordon, with Crabbe in the lead role, and as mentioned, James Pierce as Prince Thun, solidified his place in pop culture. His guest appearance on the 1979 show Buck Rogers, who was another character he played back in the 30s, showed how long lasting his influence was. So MGM got back to work making a sequel to Tarzan the Ape Man. Only it was quite choppy. Cast members changed, directors changed, script changes, and then there was the bit about getting it by the censors. By 1934, the Hayes office had started up and they began to crack down on certain subject matter, especially sexuality. O'Sullivan's outfit in this picture is more than Crab's in the other picture, but not by much. Tarzan and Jane are very physical in this movie. They truly enjoy each other's company and aren't afraid to show it, as we'll see in a minute. The plot is basically a rehash of the first movie. Harry comes back with a slimy partner to go back to the elephant's graveyard, and he also wants to bring Jane back home to England. Tarzan sees through their plan and doesn't want to help. Since Tarzan won't help, the slimy partner, Arrington, shoots an elephant, and then they're going to follow it there until it dies. Later on, he shoots Tarzan to get him out of the way, but he only wounds him. They do return to the elephant graveyard where Harry gets double-crossed and dies. Jane is captured by Arrington, but it's Tarzan and the elephants to the rescue again. The bad guy gets killed and everyone lives happily ever after. As mentioned, the film had a lot of trouble getting by the Hayes office. Along with the other instances of open sexuality, there's the swimming scene. In an attempt to get Jane to come home, Harry gives her a new dress. When she goes to show Tarzan, he's not thrilled. As they're walking on a branch over a river, he tears it off and tosses her in the water, then joins her. They then spend a couple of minutes swimming around underwater with Jane, not O'Sullivan, but her stunt double, completely naked. The scene ended up getting edited out of the film, but someone kept a copy of the unedited version in the vaults. Even more surprising is it survived the 1965 fire to be found in the late 80s when Ted Turner purchased MGM. The original version began showing up on TNT. These were the days before TCM. Partially because of this trouble, it was less successful at the box office, but has gained notoriety and is one of the films deemed historically significant enough to be in the National Registry of Film. Now, even though MGM's Tarzan was somewhat successful at the box office, Burroughs was a little unhappy with the way the studio portrayed him. He did like Weissmuller's performance, however, so there's a bit of hair splitting there. So Burroughs made another side deal to make a Tarzan film, or serial precisely, and he'd do it himself. He'd have Tarzan more like the way he'd written him, somewhat sophisticated and well-spoken, but still capable of being a wild animal. For the new Jungle Lord, they once more went to the Olympics to find him. This time they picked a track star instead of a swimmer, Herman Brix. And to change things up, they decided to shoot it in a different exotic location other than Africa, namely Guatemala. This was because they were going to make a deal with the government to shoot it there and get the president a role in the picture. The serial would be called The New Adventures of Tarzan, released in 1935, and it would involve Lord Greystoke heading down to Central America in search of a lost idol called the Green Goddess. Filming was difficult. The script underwent changes as the serial progressed, and somewhere along the way, the producer and Burroughs juggled wives and girlfriends between themselves. And you thought Fleetwood Mac, Clapton, and Harrison and those Yankees in the 70s were crazy. The first episode was basically feature length as sort of a teaser for theater owners, but by the time it ended, they did a recapped episode like one of those. Remember the time when sitcom episodes when they ran out of ideas and just did a compilation show? The later chapters were edited into a feature film of its own, Tarzan and the Green Goddess, that's been in public domain for decades and in bargain bins practically as long as I've been alive. So with this not working out, Burroughs needed to figure out how to get money real quick. He went back to MGM and made a deal with them for another Tarzan film. The New Adventures of Tarzan was the final Tarzan serial, and between various countries, it's all still in existence. As for Herman Brix, he stuck around Hollywood. He decided to change his name so producers wouldn't already think of him as Tarzan, so he came up with the name Bruce Bennett. It worked, and he had steady employment into the 60s, including playing Joan Crawford's husband in Mildred Pierce, and 3 pictures with Humphrey Bogart, including Treasure of the Sierra Madre. So now it's back to MGM and another film with Johnny Weissmuller, Maureen O'Sullivan. This time they toned down Jane's outfit and her relationship with Tarzan to keep in code. In 1936, they released Tarzan Escapes. The plot has yet another crew from England, this time Jane's cousins, telling her she needs to come back home to deal with an inheritance. They hire yet another slimy guy to get them to Tarzan and Jane, and he has eyes on taking out the ape man. We get a scene with Tarzan literally in a cage and has to be rescued once again by elephants, hence the escapes part. At the end, they kill the bad guy, and it turns out Jane needs to just sign a paper so she could stay in the jungle with Tarzan where she belongs, and they live happily ever after. Like their previous Tarzan film, MGM had all kind of problems with it. There were possibly as many as 5 directors on this film. James McKay, who picked up the pieces with Tarzan and his mate, started out on the picture. Not 100% sure of the timing on this, but there was a scene in the movie where they're in a set of caves and they're attacked by vampire bats. Supposedly, the scene was so brutal, test audiences reacted in horror. Think of the end of the log scene in King Kong, that kind. So, like that scene, it was removed from the film and has not been seen since. Eventually, MGM took the director off the film and gave the job to a writer who was looking to become a director, John Farrell, who supposedly reshot almost the entire film. However, in the end, Richard Thorpe received director credit. Farrell didn't walk away empty handed, though. He married O'Sullivan, I believe, at the end of the year. After this, MGM decided again to let the film rights lapse. Producer Saul Lesser, who had done Tarzan the Fearless, still had the rights to make 4 more Tarzan films. He wanted to get Weissmuller, but he was under contract. So yet again, they looked to the Olympics for a new Lord of the Jungle, and they found him in Glenn Morris. He'd won gold medals at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin in track and field, though I seem to remember somebody else doing pretty well in that event as well, much to Der Fuhrer's dismay. Morris was supposedly involved with one of the Third Reich's favorite underlings, Leni Riefenstahl. She said the two had a passionate affair, but one of the incidents she said clearly happened in public is on film, and nobody's blouse came open. Just look up the story online. This time, the project would be a film, not a serial, and it was called Tarzan's Revenge, released in 1938. The swimming connection here would be covered by Eleanor Holm, a popular aquatic star of the time. To make it easy on audiences, they didn't bother calling her Jane, they just call her Eleanor. The plot is sort of a cross between the first 2 MGM films and the silent pictures where Tarzan battles the Arabs. Morris was not as comfortable in front of the camera as Weissmuller, Crabbe, and Brix Bennett. He follows Buster's performance and does a lot of laughing, which is sort of ironic as his portrayal reminds me more of Harpo Marx than any of the other Tarzans. Needless to say, this film didn't do well at all, so Burroughs convinced Lesser to sell the remaining 3 films on the contract to MGM, since it was clear audiences wouldn't accept another Tarzan other than Weissmuller at this point. Audiences wouldn't accept something else, which we'll talk about after the recap of the next movie. The censors also wouldn't accept something, namely Tarzan and Jane having a child when they weren't officially married, so they put a plot point right there in the title, Tarzan Finds a Son, from that golden year 1939. And they do a tie into the books by having the child be the heir to the title Lord Greystoke. They drop the connection after the picture. So, after a plane crash, Tarzan finds the child. And as we know from pop culture, instead of giving the baby a real name, Tarzan just calls him Boy. He was played by Johnny Sheffield, supposedly hired at Weissmuller's behest. As we mentioned earlier, Maureen O'Sullivan married director John Farrell, and by this point was pregnant with her first child. No, not her yet. We'll get to that in a bit. So she wanted out of the series. The writers came up with the idea of having her take a spear in the side or in the back and die off. But again, test audiences did not accept having Jane die in this fashion, so at the last minute, they filmed Jane's miraculous recovery. And the film went on to do okay at the box office. The next film in the series was released in 1941, Tarzan's Secret Treasure. It's basically the same plot as the earlier pictures. Hunters from the outside would hear about treasure near where Tarzan is. They get him to help them find it. They try to kill him and fail, and then the elephant stampede. Weissmuller, O'Sullivan, and Sheffield were all back and joined by actors who had brothers in the business and had some tie to an Oscar. The main bad guy was played by Tom, not Tim, Conway, who is the brother of Oscar winner George Sanders. His helper with a conscience, who survives at the end of the picture, is played by Barry Fitzgerald, who won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar a few years later for Going My Way. His brother was Arthur Shields, best known for playing the Protestant Reverend in The Quiet Man, a movie with Fitzgerald as well. At this point, O'Sullivan made it very clear she wanted to be done with the series. So for the final picture of the contract, they came up with a way to get her in some more fashionable outfits by having Tarzan and Jane come to New York to save Boy from kidnappers. The title says it all, Tarzan's New York Adventure from 1942. Decades before Crocodile Dundee, Tarzan had to deal with the wonders of modern society, like sinks and toilets. The most famous scene has Tarzan running away from police by climbing up, a model of, the Brooklyn Bridge, and when they get close enough, he leaps into the East River, kind of like Steve Brody. Johnny was a very good diver, but not that good. The shot was done with a dummy dropped into a tank on the MGM lot. With that, MGM was done with Tarzan for a number of years. O'Sullivan was not only done with Jane, but done with the film industry for a number of years. John Farrell had been released from the Navy due to contracting typhoid, so she took care of him as well as their children. He eventually recovered and returned to directing. His most famous picture is Al Bundy's favorite film. I wonder if Jay Pritchett would like it too. 1953's Hondo with John Wayne. It's regarded as the Duke's best Western, not directed by John Ford or Howard Hawks, so that's high praise. It's also a bit of a diss on Henry Hathaway, the guy who directed him to the Oscar in True Grit, but as for the Pharaoh's 7 children, middle daughter Prudence was celebrated in a Beatles song. Youngest daughter Teresa, known as Tisa, did a lot of B movies in the 70s and 80s. But their most famous child is their eldest daughter Maria, who shortened her name to Mia. She's had some life, to put it mildly. Point of personal privilege for Father's Day and the upcoming summer season, you might be looking for new things to read, and if you're listening to this, science fiction may be of your interest. A novel just came out called The Empty Suit, The Tesla Entanglement. It involves time travel, a suit that gives the wearer great powers if you can actually figure out how to use it, believe it or not. And of course, the man himself, Nikola Tesla. Somebody get Glenn Beck on the phone. I'm sure he'd like to read this. You can get it on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. The author's name is Mark Harchar. If that sounds slightly familiar, it should. He's my cousin. So help a budding new author out. Okay, we're going to take a break here and we'll move into the RKO days next and then just see how far we can get. I'm kind of targeting 1968 as a break point for next time. If we can get further, we'll see. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Harchar. Thanks for listening.